Hi everyone, it's Jason Frugé here. Welcome to Frugé-ology. In this mini-series I talk about my 3 favorite things: whiskey, cigars, and barbecue, and we compare them to my other favorite thing, information security. Today I'm going to talk to you about how to prepare a brisket on the barbecue. This is my favorite cut of meat to smoke. This is a Packers cut. This is a Wagyu, 17-pound Wagyu Packers cut brisket. It's a really good cut of meat. I call it a Packers cut because it contains the point and the flat, right, of the brisket. You can find just a flat of a brisket if you want a smaller brisket. It'll separate the point for you. I'll talk to you about how to do that. The reason I like this cut is not only does it cook real well, it's a good size too at 17 pounds. Usually, anything over 15 pounds is going to cook well. I try to avoid smaller briskets because they just don't cook as consistently. But once you cook a full Packers cut, you can separate the point from the flat, and you can make burnt ends with the point, and you can make sandwiches with the flat. So it's just a really versatile piece of meat, tons of food. 17 pounds takes a while to get through, so you can share it with lots of friends. So let's talk about the anatomy real quick of a brisket. And as I said, this is a Wagyu brisket. It's the highest level of meat. It's the most premium cut. This is an American style Wagyu, so it's not quite as good as like a Japanese Wagyu. Those are a lot harder to find. The first thing I'll tell you, whenever you're picking out a brisket, you want to do what's called the bend test, where you'll pick it up and just try to fold it like this. As you can see, this one folds almost clean in half because it's a Wagyu. A choice, which is a couple levels down, a choice cut is going to fold, just a little bit, and then a prime is going to, get like a good 45-degree cut, or turn. But this is really good because it folds clean in half. So that's the first thing you want to look for. It's good to look for that kind of muscular fat in here and see that it's good and grainy. But again, if it's Wagyu, there's going to be a lot of fat in that grain for you. So I'll go ahead and tell you, and by the way, as a Wagyu cut, if you're familiar with Wagyu cows, they're absolutely lovely. But no one's ever loved this cow as much as I'm going to love it after I get done cooking this thing, I'll tell you that. So let's talk about how to trim the brisket. And I'm going to step you through how I do it. Some people try to remove all the fat, especially competition cooks will remove a lot of the external fat. You're not going to remove this intermuscular fat, you don't want to, but this external fat can get a little chewy, especially if you're being judged by a competition cook. You don't want them to get a big fatty piece. But I don't remove quite as much, but I'll show you how I do it. This fat has different textures. Some of this fat here, a little thinner, and we're going to cut that off. In fact, I'll go ahead and I like to use a boning knife to get better control. I'm just going to save that fat off to the side. And by the way, a good tip, it's a good idea to save the fat if you ever grind your own hamburger beef. If you buy like a lean like bison and some steak and like pork or anything you'd like to put in your hamburger, adding a little brisket fat really enhances the flavor. So you can save that, put it in a bag and freeze it and use it later. That way you kind of use all of this as much as you can. So we'll go ahead and just trim that down, be real careful. This fat over here, really hard fat. This will not render. Like a lot of people look for the fat to melt while they cook, but this will not melt. As you can see, this is very tough fat. So we're just gonna cut real deep and just remove that, as much of that as we can. And this is pretty tough stuff. As you can see, it just comes off like pretty hard. And you're gonna have to kind of go deep into this clavicle to get all of it. As much as you can, as I said. Some guys get really into whacking this stuff off, like I said. I'm not quite as ambitious as that with it, because I do kind of like some of the brisket fat flavor that it leaves. But it's hard fat, The reason it's a good idea to trim it is after we put the spices on here and we rub it real good, all of that flavor is not going to penetrate through this hard fat, and so when people go to eat it, they're just basically going to cut away that fat on the plate, and that's going to cut away all your spices with it, and so your rub will be wasted. So it's just good to get as much of that off as you can. The next thing I'm going to talk to you about is how I prepare a mustard, which I use as a binder. And this part over here, so we're gonna flip this over. This fat back here is all really soft and it's kind of hard to get at. So what I like to do, first of all, right down this edge, pretty much just whack. This is a harder fat on this edge over here. I pretty much just go along that whole edge there and just cut all that off. But this other stuff just, it's like a surface fat, and it's a little more difficult to get at it. What I try to do is trim down the thicker parts, and then I'll score it, which you'll see here in a second, so that the rub can kind of penetrate the fat. But this stuff isn't bad. Most of this, a lot of this will render into it. Try to get it what I can. It's kind of difficult to cut, too much of this off because it is kind of a thin layer. But wherever I feel it real fat, I'm gonna just whack it. And one of the other nice tricks when you're preparing it and cutting up the fat like this. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and leave the rest of this. Now what I do is I just score it real good like this. And just kind of, don't be afraid to whack the fat. This allows, a lot of that flavor to get down into that meat getting through the fat. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over. And whenever you have a finished brisket, you always want to cut against the grain. This really has it's very important when you cut against the grain, then the meat is very tender and pliable. When you cut with the grain, it really makes it a tougher consistency, and you might mistake you and think, I didn't cook this right. It's not true, you just didn't cut it right. It might have been great if you cut it correctly. So you want to look at how the grain runs. As you can see on here, the grain is running this way. So what I want to do, because I won't be able to see this after the meat is cooked, I want to go ahead and mark it now so I know what direction to cut. So the tip that I share with folks is just go ahead and whack a corner off like this. And that way when it's cooked, I can just give that to the dog. But once it comes off the smoker, I'll see that corner, and I'll know this is the direction I want to cut when I start slicing. The other thing I'll share with you, a lot of people like to do, see I missed a big chunk of fat there, by the way. A lot of people like to do is they'll dog ear the point so that when they go to separate it, they know exactly where the point separates from. So the way you separate the point is this little line of fat right here. This indicates the separation between the two pieces of muscle. So after I remove it from the smoker, what I'm gonna do is basically just slice right into here, and I'm gonna start to peel it away and just continue to cut. And that flat is just gonna come right off, and the point will be sitting there, right? And then I can start to slice the flat, and then the point I'm gonna cube it, I'm gonna make burn-ins with that. I'll show you that in the follow-up video. But some people, they want to go ahead and mark it now, so they'll cut into it and just pull back a piece, so it's already, like I said, dog-eared. So then later, it's easier to find that. I can just eyeball it, so I'm not going to do that, but it's your discretion. So we've already marked that. The next step is to put some mustard on there. I like to prepare my own mustard, and this is an optional step, but I think it's important, so I always recommend people do it. Mustard is going to evaporate when you cook, so you're not going to taste the mustard, but you will taste any flavoring you put into the mustard. That's going to stay. So, and by the way, some people do claim they can taste the mustard. I don't think so. I don't agree. I've never tasted the mustard. It usually just evaporates. I use a standard French's mustard, nothing fancy, right? I'll add a hot sauce. I use this Kahlua, however you say it, Cholula. I like the stuff, and a whiskey. So, and then some black pepper. So I'm gonna go ahead and just add a bunch of black pepper. And I just do this to taste. I eyeball it. I've just gotten used to how much I like in this stuff. There's a hot sauce, and then I'm gonna add this whiskey. And I wouldn't use like a top grade whiskey for this, obviously, because it's just gonna flavor the mustard. But I'll go ahead and mix that together real good. I might have used too small of a bowl here. But I'll mix this together real good. And the reason that you should do this, the reason I would encourage you to do it, is it becomes a binder, and as you slather the brisket with it, it's going to hold the rub in place. So those hard to get places where a rub might just fall off, this is going to hold it there, and it's going to help you get that better bark on the brisket. Now, a comment about this real quick. While I mix this, if I was to just put this on the smoker with no seasoning, no mustard, no anything, it would still taste very good. I mean, this is a high quality piece of meat. But when I start adding all of these ingredients, the mustard and the rubs, it really, what happens is it all becomes better together. And so, sort of like a security program, if you were to, at Onapsis, for example, we secure business critical applications. And when we provide a tremendous amount of value all by ourselves, we become even more valuable when you add other ingredients, like, for example, ServiceNow integration, where we can take vulnerability assessment data and put that into your ServiceNow system for your critical applications. We can take, threat data, indications of compromise, et cetera, and we can put those into your SIEM. For example, I was a former Onapsis customer and a CISO. One of the ways I used Onapsis in my business critical application, which was SAP, is I was able to take those SAP logs and then promote those to my Splunk instance. And using that, all of a sudden, I had visibility into all these business critical functions that we used within that SAP system. So we used it for our supply chain, we used it for our inventory, we used it for HR data, financial management, and I could never before get visibility into threats in those critical functions at that application layer without Onapsis. So I was completely blind to what was happening in there. Once I put the product in place, I integrated it with Splunk, and all of a sudden I had that peace of mind and comfort to know if something bad is happening inside that application affecting those functions, I would have, my SOC would see it, right? So we could suddenly surveil that. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. So again, better together, more ingredients. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this mustard on here. I put a healthy dose on there. I just smear that on with my hand as well. And while I'm doing this, I'm gonna make a comment about the temperature of this meat. So I took this right out of the fridge just before I started this video. And I'm gonna season this and I'm gonna put it right on the smoker quickly because I want it to be very cold. Some people, a lot of times I get the question that people will ask, they'll say, should I let it warm on the counter or come to room temperature? I would discourage you from doing that, especially with like a 17-pound piece of meat like this. That's gonna sit on your counter for like 10 hours to come to room temperature. A lot of bacteria, things like that starting to form, the meat will spoil. It's not worth it, but the most important reason why I don't do it is because the colder meat absorbs more smoke. So the colder you can put it on the smoker, the better result you're gonna get. So let's talk about, I'm gonna apply this rub. And this rub has about 20 different ingredients. So it's my own concoction, and I won't go into too much detail on it. What I like to tell people, I'll tell you a little bit, but it is my own concoction. So if you try this barbecue, it's gonna be Jason's barbecue. It'll be unlike anything you can find anywhere else. And I think that's important. That's one of the things that I love and what I'm passionate about with barbecue is I make the barbecue the way I like it, and I collect feedback from people and I tune it and I do whatever, but it's a custom barbecue that I make. But when you're just getting started, what I like to advise people is start with a basic rub, like a salt, pepper, garlic powder rub. We call it SPG. Make it yourself. It's simple. You do 50% salt, 50% pepper, then like a third portion of garlic powder. Mix that together and just sprinkle it on there. I also recommend you add some celery seed to get you started with kind of modifying it. A good layer of celery seed on top of there really enhances the flavor. So I'm gonna start adding this rub, and it's important to just get a bunch on it. We're gonna put a really healthy amount of rub. This may seem like a lot, but this is what's gonna constitute the bark. And it's just important to have a lot, so you have a nice thick bark. It's a lot of flavor that's going on there. So this rub, I do have the salt and pepper and garlic powder, but I also add, I start with a big base of a lot of brown sugar, and then I dry that out, and then once it's dry, then I add like garlic powder and pepper and salt. I also add celery salt, onion salt. I add a lot of chili powder, paprika. I add some cumin. All kinds of different things that really make it sweet and also very, very hot, because I like a spicy brisket. So as you can see, I'm getting a really heavy, I'm kind of covering up this mustard so you can't really see it. Real healthy dose on there. Don't be afraid to kind of turn it on its side and get those. I'm going to do that in a second when I get mustard over there. But over here, I've got mustard slathered on, so I can go ahead and rub that down. And you can pat it. It's okay. It doesn't make it look as pretty when you do that, but it'll soak it into the mustard a little better. Go ahead and flip that over. I'm going to repeat that process. Add a bunch of mustard on there. And again, just rub that in real good. And inside that clavicle, I just reach in there, so smother that real good. That's where I removed that fat from earlier. And then I'm gonna go ahead and Season that up. And this adds so much flavor to it. It's all about those ingredients. The other thing that's important that adds a lot of flavor is the kind of wood that you put on your smoker. Here in Texas, where I live, people are real big on using like a mesquite or oak. I'm not a fan, really. I really learned to barbecue in Kansas City. I do like Texas barbecue, don't get me wrong. But when it comes to the kind of wood I like to put on there, I'm a big fan of like cherry wood. I'm a big fan of, I like hickory. Hickory can get a little strong sometimes, especially with big pieces of meat like this that you're gonna cook for a long time. Hickory can start to get pretty heavy. Especially like mesquite can actually get putrid if you leave that on for too long. So I really don't like to work with mesquite very much. I'm gonna get in that clavicle area because I want as much of this rub on there as I can get. Just really put a heavy coat on there. You almost can't overdo the rub, you know. So as you can see, I'm using quite a bit of rub. You can't be afraid to get some mustard on there. You can see how that binder kind of holds it on those sides like that. It's real important. All right. And again, if you have any questions or comments as I'm working here, go ahead and pop them in the channel comments, and I will address them, live during the session. Really glad I'm getting to share this with you. I'm going to go ahead and share some additional tips before I take this out and put it on the smoker. So one of the things that I wanted to share is, timing-wise, this is going to take about 90 minutes a pound on the smoker. If you're cooking it around 225 degrees or so, 90 minutes a pound is what you want to budget for. But that can vary between 60 minutes a pound and 90 minutes a pound. There are some tricks you can use that will speed that process up. And I'll talk about that in just a second, but one of the things I want to show you first is, if you take it off the smoker and it was done a little faster than you wanted, what you can do is wrap it real tightly in foil and then take a cooler and put like a towel in the cooler to help kind of balance the humidity, and just set it right in the cooler, right off the smoker, super hot, put it right in the cooler. You can leave it there for 4 or 5 hours. It'll be fine. It's just that time where it's sitting there is gonna just really redistribute the juices inside the meat, continue to make it tender, but it won't continue to cook. So that's really important. And then when you take it out of the cooler, it's gonna be just as hot and just as tender as when you first took it off the smoker. You can cut it in front of your guests. And that's really, people like to see that. So it's a good tip. I've heard of people leaving them in coolers for 6 or 7 hours and they've been fine. So that's a good tip, but if you want to try to control the time of the cook, some people like to use this Texas crutch kind of thing where they wrap it while it's on the smoker. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that. So when this meat is cooking, you're going to have a period where it hits about 160 degrees internal temperature. That's the internal temperature of the meat itself. Once it hits that, you're going to hit this, what they call the stall, right? And that means the temperature inside the meat and the ambient temperature in the smoker have roughly hit the same temperature, right? The steam in the meat, I guess. So once that happens, it could sit there at the same temperature and stop cooking for 4 or 5 hours. And that adds to that time. That's why you budget that 90 minutes. If you want to break out of that stall, what a lot of people do is once it hits 160 degrees, they'll go ahead and just wrap it in foil real tight and stick it right back on the smoker. And that causes the steam to kind of boil, if you will, inside the aluminum foil. It adjusts the temperature so much that it kicks it out, it breaks out of that stall and starts cooking again very quickly. So that saves you a lot of time. So it's one of those ways to make it very predictable. I don't personally like to do that. And the reason for that is, again, that boiling the meat kind of thing that happens in the steam, it softens this rub. And I like a real firm crust, right? So I like to just leave it, unwrapped in the smoker the whole time. Unless I absolutely have to wrap it, I try to avoid that. One alternative though, which is kind of handy, is this peach paper. So this is a butcher paper. You can buy this on Amazon. It's better. I like it better than foil. It has no wax on either side of the paper. So you can wrap with that. Same thing, about 160 degrees, wrap it in the paper and stick it back on the smoker. That allows some of the steam to escape. You have some air exchange and the water kind of falls through it so it doesn't boil in there. And your bark gets a little more consistent with if you're like me and you like it to be real stiff. So that's a note on that. So I'm gonna go ahead and take you out and we're gonna put this on the smoker and show you how I do that and where I put the temperature probe. and all of that. So I'm just gonna pick this up and just walk right on out with it. This is the part where you have to be careful you don't want to drop your brisket. So I lay this on the smoker, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this temperature probe here, and I use this to monitor throughout the cook. So in my smoker's case, fish is through the side here. And where you want to insert this probe is important, because remember you've got this flat section and this point section. So you want to insert it diagonally between the two areas so that this isn't overcooked and that's undercooked, right? So I like to go about right here, right, just before the smoke, just before the point begins, and just go right in there. That's about a good placement. And that, you notice how hard it was to put that probe in. It's because that's raw meat. The longer this cooks, the more that thing's going to slide in and out. It's going to be very buttery and soft. So what I do is I cook it until it hits 203 roughly degrees, and that's going to take about 24 hours. So, or up to, it could be done in 16 hours. So I'm going to monitor this throughout the night. It's cooking slow and low. And what I'm going to do is make another video, and when it's done, and I'm going to show you what it looks like, and I'll show you how I slice it, how tender it is. I'll separate the points so you can get a feel for that. Apologize for the construction going on if you're picking up that sound. And yeah, so look forward to seeing that. There it is. There's my tips for how to prepare a great brisket. I'm looking forward to showing you the next video, so stay tuned. Thanks, guys. See you next time on Frugé-ology. Now I'm going to reward myself with my whiskey, my other favorite thing. Thanks, guys. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Hi everyone, Jason Frugé here. Welcome back to our live session of Frugé-ology. I want to share with you the results of the brisket we prepared in our session. As you recall, this was a 17-pound Wagyu brisket. Just look at how tender that is. This is really hot, fresh off the smoker. It just looks so good. I can't wait to cut into this and give it a taste. So if you recall from the session, one of the tips I gave you was to make this cut right here with a wedge, because we're going to cut against the grain, and the grain was running this way. As I mentioned, you really can't see the grain now because it's cooked and it's got this healthy bark on it from all the spices that we put on there. So now that I know which direction to cut, I can make those slices. Another thing I told you is I'm going to cut that point away from the flat, but I'm going to do this a little bit different. I'm going to actually make a cut right here about the middle, consistent with that grain wedge. I'm going to cut here, and I'm going to pull that away before I separate the point from the flat. I know that's going to leave a little bit of point meat on top of the flat meat, and I'm doing that on purpose because of presentation. It's going to leave that rub on both sides of those slices. If I really separated it clean, then there would be no rub on that one side. So let's go ahead and dig into this and get started. Now, one of the things I'll tell you is that whenever you're cutting a brisket and people are around, you have to be really, really protective of your cut. Oh, let's take a look at that. Oh yeah, that's pretty. Ooh, that's so tender. All right, so I separated that. Actually, I'm gonna slice on the end here. You have to be really protective of your slice because that first slice is really the cook's privilege, and people will try to steal that from you. They'll take it right off your plate if you're not careful, if you're not. Okay. All right, well, let's cut. You want to cut these real thin because this is like a sandwich meat. So these real nice slices are what you're looking for. So let's go ahead and do the pull test, and I'll show you how tender that is. Oh, that looks great. So the first thing people like to do is just kind of drape the meat, kind of bounce it a little bit so you can see how good that looks. The other test is the pull test. It just kind of pulls apart. I just broke right apart. So I'm gonna give that a little bite, get some bark on there. Let's see how that tastes. So good. That's so good. All right, now I'm gonna skip that. I'll slice the rest of that up in a bit. I'm gonna show you how to separate that point. So if you recall, there was a ridge of fat that showed up on the side there. I remember it's about right here. So I'm gonna cut into that, and I'm gonna cut diagonally down to separate the point. The point, there's a big fatty tissue area in here. I'm just gonna cut right through that. And so I'm peeling it away from the top. And now I've got my point. Whoop. Slicing, kind of tearing through. That's okay, because what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cube this fatty area here. You can see that kind of coming off. I'm just gonna set this in this pan, and I'm gonna cut that into cubes And I'm gonna make burnt ends with that. And you can see from one of our prior Frugé-ology videos, I show you how to do this, cut it into squares. We cover that with brown sugar and some of the homemade sauce recipe I shared with you. Put that back on the smoker and let it finish caramelizing there. It's gonna be so good. Guys, this really came out well. I'm pretty proud of the work we did. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time on Frugé-ology.